Good evening. Welcome to Convention of States Indiana Live. Do you think we have a big problem with our federal government? If you do, stay tuned because we at Convention of States have a solution as big as the problem. Our broadcast host is Dale Parrish. He's the Convention of States Indiana State Director. Take it away, Dale.
Well, thank you, Maringo Mike, for that introduction, and I want to welcome everyone again to our broadcast this evening. I kind of messed up. I probably should not have scheduled a broadcast for tonight since this is Memorial Day, but I just didn't look closely at the calendar and didn't even think about it. So anyway, this is Memorial Day, and I just want to say I hope everyone has taken some time today to give their thoughts and prayers to those that have sacrificed everything for our country. I am a veteran myself, and so on this day I always give thanks to those that have, like I said, that have sacrificed everything so that we can have this day, and so that we can have the country that we have. So we all owe a huge debt of gratitude to these individuals. So anyway, I want to welcome you to our broadcast tonight. We have another special broadcast lined up for you. Let me, if I can, let me go through the different segments that we're going to be involved in tonight with the broadcast. And our first segment, of course, is the topic of discussion. Now, sometimes we'll have maybe a panel discussing a particular topic, or we'll have an individual from the Convention of States leadership group nationally or here in the state in for an interview. But tonight we once again have I call her our super volunteer, and that's Debbie Stewart, who will be presenting us another chapter in constitutional literacy. So I think you're going to find it another exciting chapter presented by Debbie Stewart. So that'll be in our first segment. When Debbie's finished, then we'll get into some general information. I'll bring up my PowerPoint, share some information, resources that we have here available to us in Indiana, as well as nationally, and give you some numbers on how we're doing here in the state of Indiana so far. So once that segment's done, and then we'll get into what we call the Convention of States Basics. These are the three tenets that our program is based upon. So we'll cover the basics. Then we'll try our best to recognize our viewers that have tuned in this evening. And if you are a viewer, feel free to ask a question or make a comment in the chat section. Keep it very brief, since I'm limited as to how many characters I can put on at any one particular time. So after viewer recognition, then we'll get into the closing of the program and wrap things up, tell you what we have in store for you next Monday evening, and wrap up the broadcast. Now, before I go any further, I want to make an announcement. I'm going to make it here at the beginning, and then we'll make it again at the closing. But I just want you to know that we are going to be having what we refer to as an Indiana Convention of States Leadership Summit. We're going to do this via Zoom. In other words, it'll be a virtual summit, just as if we were actually conducting a summit meeting at a particular location, but this will be a virtual summit. Our featured speaker at the summit is going to be Mark Meckler, president of Convention of States. So we're very, very pleased and anxious to have Mark come on and speak to us, and he'll of course be conducting a Q&A session. We'll also be giving out some awards that evening, and I might also mention that now if you're in leadership, you'll be able to participate in this. But if you're not in leadership, but you would like to view the summit, we're going to be streaming the summit through our YouTube channel, COS Indiana. So keep that in mind. Now, we'll be talking about this as time goes on here. Once again, the summit is June 13th. That's a Saturday at 10 a.m. So be sure to put that on your calendar, and hopefully you can tune in and watch that summit. All right. Well, without further ado, let's get into the first segment here, and we bring in Debbie. And there is Debbie. Hi, Debbie.
Hi.
Glad to have you this evening, and always look forward to you coming on and giving us another chapter.
Well, it's great to be here.
All right. Well, tonight's topic, if we have this right, is the free exercise of religion. So take it away.
Okay, great. So the free exercise of religion, which actually is really critical at this point in time, because we're seeing that play out almost every day on the news between state governments, federal governments, local people. There's enough information out there to keep you busy every day if you're tracking this stuff.
That's right.
So, okay, so let's talk a little bit about just what I want to cover, or objectives of the free exercise of religion. So we want to talk about what's the difference between the Establishment Clause, which I talked about 2 times ago, and the Free Exercise Clause, both found in the First Amendment. We want to talk about laws can be unconstitutional either on their face or as applied. We'll talk about what those are. We want to know the difference of the freedom to believe and the freedom to act, because that's important. And then also we're going to talk about some balancing tests that the Supreme Court has come up with in order to help mitigate these issues. So let's move on to terms just real quick. The Free Exercise Clause it's the clause of the First Amendment specifying that Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the First Amendment here in a little bit, but just to let you know what that Free Exercise Clause says. And then we're going to talk about something later called the Sherbert Test, which is a balancing test that the government has come up with, the Supreme Court came up with to figure out who wins when there's a governmental interest versus the free exercise of religion, who wins on those cases, okay? So, but before I get into the actual free exercise clause, I want to talk about something called the Cantwell Case. So the Cantwell Case happened in 1938, and there was a man named Newton Cantwell, and he lived in Connecticut, and he was a Jehovah's Witness, and him and his 2 sons decided they were trying to proselytize and witness to people about their religion. So they happened to go into what I would consider an anti-Catholic neighborhood and started talking to these people, but some of the literature they had was very anti-Catholic. So it was a Catholic neighborhood. Sorry about that. It's a Catholic neighborhood, and they started talking about anti-Catholic rhetoric. Well, things got out of hand, things got violent, and so the police came in and arrested them. And so the Cantwells were arrested, and so they appealed to the Connecticut Supreme Court. The Connecticut court also sided with the local government there, that they had the right to arrest them. But then he appealed again to the Supreme Court of the United States, but the Supreme Court sided with Cantwell and reversed it and said that they ruled that this legitimate civil need of keeping peace in the neighborhood did not outweigh their free exercise of religion. So this was an important case. Okay, so the issue became, a big question came up: when and under what circumstances does a governmental interest override the free exercise of religion? Which is a great question. So, so now that we've kind of set that up, the free exercise clause, and I'm gonna flip back to I'm gonna read the First Amendment here, because we talked 2 times ago about the Establishment Clause. The Establishment Clause says this. It's the first clause of the First Amendment, and it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, which means that they can't set up any state church, right? They cannot do that, all right? The second clause of the amendment says, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And in that second clause, the free exercise clause, the government cannot interfere with our playing out of religion. Okay, so those are the 2 main points. And again, we covered the Establishment Clause a couple times ago. So that is what the free exercise clause is. So to summarize that, Establishment Clause prevents the government from setting up a religion, and the free exercise clause prohibits the government from interfering with our religious practice. Okay? So now let's talk about the freedom to believe versus the freedom to act. So there's, okay, so let me see. I guess we don't have I didn't put this on the schedule. We want to talk about the two ways a law can be unconstitutional. So the first way a law can be unconstitutional is called on its face. And that's when a law is blatantly unconstitutional. No matter what situation it's put in, it's unconstitutional. But there's another way, it's called as applied. And a law that is unconstitutional as applied means that it can be constitutional in some certain situations, but unconstitutional in other certain situations. And so it's those ones that we have to figure out, how do we balance governmental interest with the freedom of religion? Okay, now inside of that situation, we have two things. It's called the freedom to believe versus the freedom to act. And so the Supreme Court said there's really two pieces of the free exercise clause. Well, first of all, it says free exercise. So that means you're acting on your religion. But you can believe anything you want. You can believe anything you want, absolute, but you can't always act on what you believe. So an example would be, I'm going to go way back to the Old Testament, is a lot of the people in the Old Testament says that they actually worshiped a god named Moloch, but they also did child sacrifice to Moloch. So for example would be that in our day today, right, I could say that I believe in child sacrifice, but if I go try to sacrifice a child, I'm in jail and I'm in there for the rest of my life, right?
Right.
And that was the whole point. So freedom to believe is absolute. You can believe anything you want, but you can't always act on it because there can be a morality issue. You're breaking certain civil laws.
Now this is within what again now? This is
just what the Supreme Court came up with.
Okay.
In the Cantwell case, they established a two-tiered system to take a look at governmental interest versus the freedom to have religion.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
All right.
So, so one of the general principles that came out was the government should never be able to regulate religious actions based solely because they're religious. That wouldn't be fair. That would be discriminating. So the main question is, what kind of religious conduct should be protected by the Constitution? And what kinds of religious exercise should the government be able to prohibit? And that became a big issue. So we would go with, well, what did the founding fathers intend? That would be to me, the most important question to ask, right? But part of the problem was the Supreme Court didn't really spend a lot of time figuring out what the founding fathers would intend. Unfortunately, they never really attempted to determine that. And instead, they just moved forward to come up with what we call a balancing test. Balancing religious freedom with governmental interest. Okay, which ones should they prohibit, and which religious actions should they allow? So that leads us to what we call the Sherbert Test, and the Sherbert Test came out of a case in 1963, Sherbert versus Werner, and basically they came up with a 4-part test. It's a compelling interest test, but we call it the Sherbert Test because it was on the Sherbert case. And that is 4 questions that the Supreme Court will ask, designed to balance the compelling interest with religious freedom. So question 1 of the test is, was the person pursuing a sincere religious belief? Well, they almost always rule yes, because it's really subjective. So how do you tell somebody, well, you don't really believe that? Right. So that typically, that passes. And then the second question is, did the law impose a substantial burden on the exercise of one's religious beliefs? Question 3 is, does the law fulfill compelling governmental interests? And then the fourth one is, can the government reach the goal they want with a less alternative or less restrictive alternative? Because sometimes the government wants to get from point A to point B, and the way they do it really doesn't need to be done that way. There's a better way to do it. So for example, there was a case a while back where the government said, well, they were talking about homeschooling. They said, well, if you're a homeschooler, you have to have a teacher certificate in order for for us to make sure your kids are taught well. Well, that's not really fair, because there's people in the public school system that have teacher degrees, but they don't always have students that do well, so they realize that there's got to be a less restricted alternative there. So this Sherbert test is, unfortunately, it works to a certain point, but it was done again, kind of concluding this whole thing is that they did not look at the founding fathers' original intent or any of the documents back then to see how would they have handled this whole thing about a governmental interest versus religious exercise. And it's unfortunate, but they never really took into account the founding fathers' intentions. So it was a little short-sighted. They do use it some, but it can be subjective in some areas. Mm-hmm. And then I know that last time we met, we talked about the religious freedom, what President Trump was doing, but now Attorney General Barr just came out Saturday and said he's assembling a team in the Department of Justice to deal just with preserving religious freedom, which I thought was great. And he said, the Constitution is not suspended even in times of a pandemic. There is no pandemic exception to the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And he's saying that churches are being discriminating against because they're all being considered non-essential. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out with the state governors versus the federal government.
Yes, yes. I tell you, this chapter is so timely that you're presenting, isn't it?
It's amazing.
You see so much of this going on in the news now about churches being deemed non-essential and so forth, and meetings, and it's just very, very timely. So I'm glad we were able to bring you on tonight.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I know we've had some cases where people who actually pulled into a parking lot to watch a church service done outside, and they were all sitting in their cars, each got a $500 ticket.
Yeah.
Sitting in their cars, and General Barr, he challenged that one too. He's like, you can't do that to people. They're following social distancing. They're in their own cars. They're not breaking any of the recommendations, but they still got ticketed.
My mother-in-law that lives with us, 93-year-old lady, the church she goes to opened up for the first time this past Sunday, and they asked the elderly to not attend, to stay home and view the service via streaming like they always do. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was kind of unusual, or kind of a good step, since it's the elderly that is one of the classes, one of the groups most apt to come down with the virus. So yeah. That's one of the steps that they took. They just asked the elderly not to attend this first service, right, where they opened things up. And of course, they had social distancing, and went to all different steps to be as safe as possible. So
yeah,
glad to see that. Glad to see that.
Yes, me too.
Yeah. All right, Debbie. Once again, thank you very much.
You bet.
And for those of you, we'll be bringing Debbie back. I think we have her scheduled for June 8th. So we'll be bringing her back again for another chapter in constitutional literacy. So Debbie, thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
Have a good evening. Good night.
Good night.
All right, Debbie Stewart. Always love having Debbie on because her chapters on constitutional literacy are so good, so good. So let's get into. Let me bring up my PowerPoint, and we'll get into. And I'm going to implement the slideshow option here so that you get a full screen as best as possible. And we'll try that again here. There you go. That should give you a full screen. Okay, let's talk about the resources that we have available to us here in Indiana. Our main resource is the national website, conventionofstates.com. You're going to hear us make reference to this website frequently. if you're wanting to get involved in Convention of States, this is the first place to go to, where you can open an account and become a supporter. But wealth of information on this website. Embedded in the website is our state website page, conventionofstates.com/Indiana. Social media platforms. The main one we're on is Facebook. Our state Facebook page, Convention of States Indiana, where actually this broadcast is coming to you through that Facebook page. YouTube channel, COS Indiana, very much an educational resource where we have some narrated PowerPoints. We have recordings of these broadcasts. We also have links to a great podcast that Paul Phillips, our legislative liaison, you've seen Paul on the broadcast here many times, but Paul does a podcast called The Free to Be Free. And every podcast that he does, we set up a link to that podcast for you on our YouTube channel. So COS Indiana. I might remind you once again that our leadership summit coming up in June is going to be streamed through this YouTube channel. So again, keep this in mind, COS Indiana. We're also on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. We're on a number of different platforms. So if you're a social media type individual, you should not have any trouble finding us in the social media world. Some quick numbers. 2019, we surpassed 41,000 supporters here in the state of Indiana. Been growing tremendously. Our goal for 2020 is 52,000, and we're well on track to achieve that goal. So we're moving along quite well here in Indiana. About 2,900 volunteers. We have over 40 individuals in leadership positions here in our state. Once again here now, if you want to get involved in Convention of States, if nothing else, to just become a supporter, which is very important, again, go to our national website, conventionofstates.com, open an account, sign the petition, and you become a supporter. Now, if you have some time and you want to get more involved, click on the menu selection, take action, scroll down to where it says become a leader, and take a look at the different volunteer positions that we have. If one's of interest to you, go ahead and open it up, read about it. If you're very interested, go ahead and make application. You're not obligated in any way. But what that does is your name then comes up on a report that I and some others see every day, and one of us will be in contact with you to talk to you about that position. So now I also want to stress that when you look at these positions, keep in mind the amount of time that you have available to dedicate to Convention of States. We all have different priorities. We all have time constraints that are different. And so when you look at these different positions, be sure to look at the estimated amount of time that is required for these positions. Some are very little, some take quite a bit more. So keep that in mind. All right. Let's get in now to the basics of Convention of States. And the basics are the problem, the solution, and the plan. Now, the problem that we see with our federal government is that our federal government lacks the will and courage to address some basic structural issues. We've defined the problem further by identifying 3 abuses that we believe are being done by the federal government. The first one is the national debt. It was over 23 trillion, and with this virus and the stimulus, no telling where this is going to end up now. I think probably safely somewhere over 25 trillion. So there was really little to no action being taken before the virus hit, and so this is an abuse. This needs to be addressed in our country, and it's not being addressed. The second one's a regulatory crisis. I know our current administration's eliminated a lot of regulations, but much, much more needs to be done in this area, specifically in how these regulations get created and what control that we have, if any, over the creation of these regulations. And the last one has to do with state sovereignty. This is where the balance of power between the states and the federal government has tilted all in favor of the federal government. We believe that the career politician plays a big role in this. So this is where we are going to suggest and push for term limits on Congress as well as other federal officials. So those are the abuses that we've identified in our federal government, which comprise the problem. Well, the solution. This is what Convention of States is all about. Article 5 of our Constitution describes the two methods whereby the Constitution can be amended. And we'll briefly go through the two methods. But this, I just want to point out, these two methods are described in Article 5. So we're not making this up. It's right in Article 5 of our Constitution. The first method, and this is the one we're used to seeing, and this is where 2/3 of Congress propose an amendment, and that proposed amendment then has to be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures, or 38 states. Okay, that's how our amendments have been created to date. Well, there's a second method right in Article 5, and it's never been used. And that's where 2/3 of the state legislatures apply to conduct a convention of states for the purpose of proposing amendments to the Constitution. This is what we want to see happen. Any proposed amendments then would have to go through the same ratification process as in the first method. 3/4 of the states, or 38 states, would have to ratify any proposed amendment before it became an amendment to the Constitution. 2/3 of the state legislatures, that's 34 states, have to make application for this to happen. This is what we want to see happen, folks. Well, what's our plan to bring this about? Our plan's basically in two parts. The first part is the application strategy. This is where we need to get, as we said, 34 states to make application, and the applications have to be the same. The subject matter of the applications must be the same. We've already designed the application that we want the states to use. So the subject matter would specify that the convention address fiscal restraints, limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and term limits. That's where the subject matter of this application that determines the agenda of the convention. Now, the second part of our plan is mobilizing the grassroots. And when we say the grassroots, we're talking about you, me, and our state legislators. These are the people that are going to make this happen. And we have a great deal of momentum going to make this happen. Like I said, we need 34 states. We've got 15 so far that have signed on to make this happen. Unfortunately, we had high hopes for this year, but the virus has kind of put a damper on our efforts. But the momentum is still going. Legislatively, we're in all 50 states, so we got a lot. The groundwork is being prepared. We've got 15 states that have in fact made application and signed the resolution, is what it's called. And Indiana is one of those states, I will say. We were the 6th state to pass the resolution. So once again, if you're interested in getting involved in Convention of States, go to our national website, conventionofstates.com, open an account, and become a supporter and get involved. We definitely need your help. All right, that's it for the basics this evening. And let me get those off here and bring myself back on. Now, this would be the time that we recognize our viewers tonight. And I don't see anybody that has signed on tonight. And that's probably due to the holiday. And that's my fault for maybe skipping tonight's broadcast. But anyway, this broadcast, I might mention, as well as all other broadcasts, are recorded and will be on our state website, our state Facebook page. So tomorrow, be sure to check on that and take a look at the recording. Let's hope we get a number of people that do. All right, let me bring up what I want to talk about in our closing here. And as a matter of fact, what I'm going to do before I get into that is I want to mention our Indiana Convention of States Leadership Summit coming up June 13th at 10 a.m. June 13th is a Saturday now at 10 a.m. Our speaker is Mark Meckler, President of Convention of States. So be sure to tune in, and if you're not in leadership, then you'll have the ability to view the summit via streaming from our YouTube channel, COS Indiana. So we'll be talking about this more and more, but June 13th, 10 a.m. All right, guys. I always like to close with a quote that our president, Mark Meckler, has always said, and I just think it's so very good. And he has said that that our country's facing a fundamental question. Okay? The question is not what should we do. The question is who will decide. And yes, the question facing us is a two-word question, very simply, who decides? And we believe we, the people, should have a greater say-so in decisions not only being made at the federal government level, but at the state and local level. So you're going to hear us talking about, I'm going to mention this one more time, you're going to hear us talking more about this, and that's the concept of self-governance. And I think in today's time, and with what's going on in our world right now, the concept of self-governance is so important, and that's basically us as individuals being involved, getting involved in our government, be it at the federal level or at the state or local level, being involved and getting involved to make our country a better place to live. So this is what we're all about. You're going to hear us talking more and more about the concept of self-governance. As a matter of fact, our vision statement for Indiana is to create a Hoosier grassroots community of citizens and state legislators dedicated to the constitutional concept of self-governance. It's a constitutional concept. So, folks, I invite you one more time, if you're not involved in Convention of States, we would love to have you involved. Go to our national website, open an account, become a supporter, and that's exercising self-governance right there. Becoming a supporter of Convention of States, you're exercising self-governance. So, with that said, I'll wrap things up for this evening, and I did want to mention now, before we sign off here, that next Monday evening, our broadcast, we're going to have on our newest region captain, Larry Hudson. And we're going to do a little something different. I wasn't able to line Larry up for an actual a live interview, so I caught up with Larry and we recorded an interview. And so I'll be playing that recording in our first segment where I interviewed Larry. Larry's been a tremendous district captain for us, and so we've decided to promote him to a region captain, and he's going to actually be covering 2 regions for us. So tune in next Monday night and meet Larry Hudson and see what kind of job Larry has ahead of him. So with that said, I want to once again thank everyone for tuning in this evening. We need your help. So if you're interested in convincing the states, it's time to get involved, folks. It's time to get involved. All right. Good night, everybody. That's it. Have a good one. Bye.